What brought me to the story was the fact that I had just finished my prior book, Our Kind of People, which, as you pointed out, looked at the black upper class. And I had been lecturing around the country about that book, talking about the history of sort of old black wealthy families that participated in debutante cotillions. Kids were in Jack and Jill. They had summer houses in Martha's Vineyard or Sag Harbor. And this was a group where a lot of them went to Howard or Spelman or Morehouse and was old money. And while I was lecturing one time actually to a group of students at Harvard about the book, someone looked through the pages of the book and they saw a photograph of Senator Ed Brooke. And he was there posing with a black debutante from Detroit. And the caption said, Senator Ed Brooke posing with a Detroit debutante. And the student in the audience raised his hand. He said he was a U.S. senator? And I said, yes. And he said, well, I thought Carol Moseley Braun was the first black U.S. senator. It really shows you how the collective memory is so short. Yes. So I said, well, actually, believe it or not, 100 years before Senator Ed Brooke, there was Senator Blanche Bruce, who was also black. And I said, interestingly enough, his son went here to Harvard. And so the audience was very interested because most people didn't know, first of all, that there was a black senator in the 1800s. And they certainly didn't know that he was well-to-do enough or sophisticated enough to have sent a son to Harvard in the 1890s. So I didn't know much more about the story. And when people in the audience started asking me questions, I realized I should know this. So that's when I started my research. And what I ultimately found out was in completing Our Kind of People, I thought, well, maybe there's also a family out there that represents or epitomizes the black upper class. Maybe I could find a dynasty. And so when I came upon the Bruce family, I said, here is my dynasty, because I found 3 generations of this black family that started from slavery. Blanche Bruce he's the senator in the title, the Senator and the Socialite. And the Socialite in the title is his wife, Josephine Wilson, who grew up in Philadelphia, and her father was a very successful black doctor in Philadelphia. So the Senator and the Socialite is really about not just the politics of Reconstruction, but it's also about the evolution of this family from him being born a slave in 1841 and then following it 3 generations from there.
A lot of biographers will just put the senator and the wife will be a sort of afterthought.
Right.
You put them as equal co-partners, if you will, in the book.
Right, because for me, they are the ultimate power couple. In the same way that, today that we look at Bill and Hillary Clinton, or we look at, several years ago when Bill and Camille Cosby gave $20 million to Spelman College, we looked at couples and at entities, the same way people looked at Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, is that a lot of these high-powered men or high-powered women wouldn't get where they are if it was not also for the synergy that came from spousal support. And for the senator, in my book's case, the Senator Bruce, he had a tremendous amount of support from his wife and his wife's family because she had education. She was already a school teacher in Cleveland. Her father was a doctor. Her mother was educated. Her sisters were all teachers. Her brother was a lawyer. They had the polish and the sophistication to help him, although he was born a slave and had gone to Oberlin for 2 years. He was not necessarily comfortable in affluent settings, black or white. And their marriage in 1878 allowed him to purchase an incredible townhouse on DuPont Circle, which is a national landmark today, and they could entertain. She knew what types of people to invite. I mean, they were both blacks and whites. Of course, they were white Republicans then because that was the liberal group at that time. And when he was first started off as a tax assessor, then a sheriff in Mississippi, and then the Mississippi Republicans embraced him and said, we can run you for the Senate. And then after he became a senator for 2 years, he got married. And it was one of the smartest, both not just emotional, personal decisions, but also a smart political decision for him because she was the one that knew how to grease the wheels and socialize and invite and get him. They ended up becoming very close friends with President Grant, and that was mostly because of her savvy.
I see. He was born in 1841. He was born a slave.
Yes. It's interesting because he and I had to do a lot of digging during the 5.5 years of research on this, he did not write about his experience as a slave. Where that information is gained is mainly through letters from his brothers to him or from him to his brothers. So he never wrote publicly in the Washington papers or Mississippi papers. He would only speak personally to other individuals. So I had to call this information from letters, which in a sense made it even better than coming from newspapers because it actually meant that it was his voice. He was born in Virginia and on a plantation in Virginia, and he was born to a family that was not a very wealthy family. They were wealthy enough to own a few slaves, but they moved around. They moved to Missouri. They sold their plantation in Missouri. In Virginia moved to Missouri. Then they later moved to Mississippi, then moved back to Missouri. And sometimes they rented out their slaves. But fortunately for Blanche, unlike many other slaves, they never broke up the family. So he was there with his brothers, with his sisters, with his mother, Polly. They were never divided.
Now, his father was a slave owner.
His father was a slave owner.
And it was illicit relations, if you will, or it was a form of
forced relations. I mean, his mother didn't have a choice in that situation, even though she was, quote unquote, treated well in the sense that her children were allowed to be educated by some of the personal tutors of the white owners' white children. And like I said, they were never sold off separately. So even till his mother's death, he was very close to her. He was still in contact with, and one of his brothers went into politics in Kansas and ran for the Kansas State Assembly, that they all remained intact, an intact family. They did not all get the same education that he did. I mean, I think that it was only 2 of the brothers, he and 2 of the other brothers, that ended up going to college. And that was even rare at that time.
Now, and of course, he had half siblings who were white.
Exactly.
How did he escape?
Right. Well, basically, what had ended up happening, a couple of his brothers really ran away. When one of his, I guess, half brother, a white brother, went off to fight in the Civil War, and this was in 1863, he left at the same time, and it was not. Because his owners did not have a great deal of wealth, but also they didn't have a lot of children and they didn't need that many slaves to work their property, there wasn't great difficulty for him to leave. I mean, it was one of those rare circumstances where the greater fear was not from his owners because they were ready to let him go. And as I said, they were even ready to let him be educated at Oberlin. They said, this is where you're going to get education. But his fear was being captured by people that would return him or sell him into slavery to some other family or slave owner. That was the greater fear. So he ended up going to Kansas and then ultimately went to Ohio and spent 2 years in Ohio at Oberlin, where there was a large free population of blacks who were either former slaves or people who were born free, because Oberlin was one of those rare towns and rare schools that was willing to educate blacks.
When you read books like this about the 19th century, you always think about how treacherous and dangerous it is for black people to be free or slave. I mean, it's just you live in an atmosphere of fear and terror. And there was one incident I read in the book that he almost was killed in a like a terrorist
raid,
in Kansas.
Exactly. I mean, he went through a lot.
Yeah.
He went through a tremendous amount, even despite the fact of the grace and polish that he demonstrated in the Senate floor. 20 years later, he had the more often the typical experience of a slave of that period. Always being fearful that you could be captured by somebody else, either killed or sold back into slavery. And the worst thing would have been to be sold back into slavery like in Alabama, Mississippi, in the very deep South. Whereas in areas like Virginia, areas like Missouri, the work was not, the slave owners were not as brutal as they were on those plantations, like where they were growing sugar cane, because it's just they were in an environment which was not as difficult and painful. I mean, even the temperatures. I mean, it was not like working down in Mississippi and Alabama. Those were really the worst, most brutal places for these workers. And it was an awful experience either way, but he was much more fortunate because of who owned him.
So when his half brother left to fight for the Confederacy.
Right.
In 1863, he left the plantation. And that was, I guess he was like 21, 22 years old.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then from that point, in a 10, 11, 12-year period, he becomes a U.S. Senator.
I know. That could not even happen today, since we sit here with only one black. 132 years later, we still only have one black in the U.S. Senate.
I mean, that's unbelievable. What happened in
that?
That
Is Reconstruction. That tells the story of Reconstruction, which is really what is captured in this book, is the opportunities that were available at that time, particularly in the South, for Reconstruction, when the Republicans needed desperately to they owned the government. They owned the government, and they needed people to hold positions. There was remember, in many of the states like Mississippi, South Carolina, the largest percentage of the population were blacks, were these black freed slaves. So for those rare blacks who had been educated, wherever they were educated, in the North, wherever, Midwest, there were opportunities to hold local political positions, like the ones he held: sheriff, tax assessor. Because he had education, he was able to be a local small superintendent of schools. But the Republican Party, the white Republicans, were recognizing that if we really want to hold on to these blacks in our party, the black voters, we have to be willing to run some of them for bigger positions, like lieutenant governor. And there were several that were in the House of Representatives. He was one of those rare, very skilled, very savvy individuals that was not even, they wanted to run him for lieutenant governor, and he held back and said, no, I want U.S. Senate. And people thought, you're crazy. And his close friend, Congressman James Lynch, who was one of his close advisors, who was already in the House of Representatives, said, you're going to hold out for the Senate? There's never going to be, you'll never get that. But he did. But it was because of his friendships and his savvy. He was a very, very good politician, understanding that he had to unify the blacks and the whites But the thing about him, which lost favor among some blacks, is that he was not radical. He was not radical. He was very, very moderate. And some blacks felt he was too conservative. But and I hate to just call it just political expediency, but for a black to hold that kind of role, it was impossible for them to have been a radical in the 1870s. But it was because of that savvy, and because he was extremely articulate, and also knew how to hire people to work for him, because he had amassed, I should say, while he was a tax assessor, he amassed a lot of land that had been foreclosed on all these white Democrats, white Southern Democrats there. So he was investing in rental properties while he was a local elected official. So it was also his money that allowed him the access to really basically buy support from people as well.
Now, this is all remarkable because this is after the Civil War in Mississippi. And for a black man to do all this, what's going on down there?
Well, the terrorizing really did not start of blacks until like 1877. That was when so he was already in, and in fact, after he was elected to the Senate, there were only about two members or one or two members black in the House. Before then, there had been several. But the 1876 elections were very corrupt. 1877 was basically when President Hayes agreed to the compromise of 1877, which said we will end Reconstruction, we will pull out federal troops, which gave a rise to the Ku Klux Klan, because they said, okay, here's our opportunity to keep blacks from voting, to either kill them, scare them, terrorize them enough that if they vote, that they vote for the white Southern racist Democrats, or just, put them back in their place where they were as slaves. They weren't owned anymore, but they were going to be paid a pittance for the work that they did on these now called farms that were plantations. And he himself ended up buying an 800-acre plantation because he had that kind of money. But he could not go back to Mississippi to campaign.
Yeah, I was reading that in a book, which was really interesting. We're on WBAI. We're talking with Lawrence Otis Graham. He is the author of a brand new book called The Senator and the Socialite, The True Story of America's First Black Dynasty, in particular the story of the first black to serve a full term in the U.S. Senate, Senator Blanche Bruce from Mississippi. He was a Republican. It was interesting in 1870s. I still can't. My mind's like trying to wrap around that. But let's go back just a bit, because it's so much in this book, and it's very richly detailed. when the senator, he at that time, the senators were elected by the representatives in the legislature.
Exactly. Right.
And
at that time they were all mostly Republican.
Mostly Republicans in Mississippi.
Exactly.
When he was elected overwhelmingly.
Yes.
You really give a good picture of when he was in his first day in the Senate. Well,
it is customary and still today, it's still customary that when a junior senator in a particular state is sworn in, they are escorted down the aisle to the front, where they're to be sworn in by the senior senator from that state. At the time that he was being sworn in, it was Senator James Alcorn, obviously a white Republican, was to walk him down the aisle. So Senator Bruce stood up when they called his name, and he looked around waiting for Senator Alcorn. Alcorn picked up a newspaper and started reading the newspaper because he refused. He was not going to walk a black man down the aisle. He was like most of the men in that room, he was a racist. And he didn't want to do it. So he started to walk down by himself. And then suddenly Senator Roscoe Conkling, interestingly enough, from New York, senator from New York, said, "I will do it," and ran up to him and said, "I will escort you to the front." And that began a very close relationship between them. Senator Conkling became his mentor along with Senator George Hoar from Massachusetts, both wealthy, liberal white men. And Senator Bruce became so close and was so grateful to the mentoring and support that he got from Conkling. He and Josephine named their first child after him. So their child was Roscoe Conkling Bruce. That's where that name came from. So from the very beginning, he had an awkward relationship with the white senators who were in that Senate chamber with him during those 6 years.
Interesting. Good chunk of your book, half your book is devoted to the other half of the family, the socialite half, which is his marriage to Josephine Wilson. Tell us a bit about her and how they got together, please.
Yeah, well, she was born and raised in Philadelphia. Her father was Joseph Wilson. She was one of 4 children. She had a brother who was an attorney, both in Philadelphia and Cleveland. Both of her parents were, even though she is light complexion, and you can see from the pictures in the book, it was tough collecting all these different photos of family members and others. But she is a very light complexion woman, and which was both helpful and it was also a hindrance. It was helpful in the sense that it allowed them to move comfortably among white society in Washington, white, wealthy, liberal society, not Democrats, but liberal Republicans. It was also helpful for them as they moved around the affluent black society of Washington because most of the affluent blacks in Washington were light complexion black people, as I talked about a lot in my Our Kind of People book, and got in a lot of trouble for that. But that was the crowd. What was interesting, though, it became a hindrance because there was the larger black population, the voters, who looked at her and said, although they knew she was black, they said she's too light to really care about our experience and our concerns as black people, as brown people. And it was also a hindrance in the sense that for her own political activities, because she was very, very active, she ran for the National Association of Colored Women for the presidency, ironically against Booker T. Washington's wife, Margaret Washington. And they loved Josephine Wilson, but they said, "You're too light. You're too light. You can't go out there and represent us around the country for black women because your skin color is just too light." So that cut both ways for her. But she was a well-educated woman, very sophisticated, very savvy. Her father, ironically, in Philadelphia, had written a book about the black upper class of Philadelphia in 1841, the same year that Blanche Bruce was born. So he was well known about the black upper class. Their family was, but she was a great advisor to the senator. But her family also had some problems because her brother, like her, was light enough to pass. Her brother ultimately, her brother's name was Leonidas Wilson. He ultimately did pass for white and worked in a white Philadelphia law firm, then a Cleveland law firm. And there's a great excerpt from the book about this whole issue of passing in this book. In the current issue of Reader's Digest, they have a great excerpt there. But it's just interesting how her family sort of walked the line between black and white, whereas Blanche's family was a completely black family, and the difficult part was when they got married, he did not even invite any of his family members. I think only one brother was invited to his wedding because they were not educated, they were not light complexioned, and they didn't have money the way the Wilsons' family money.
There was some trepidation on her family's part about him because he was a slave.
Right. He was already a senator when they got engaged.
Right.
And the family was, happy when he would come to Cleveland and visit, but they would not allow him to stay in their house. Uh-huh. So this is the black family saying, no, we don't want that. Oh, yeah, he's a senator. Yeah. But for them, it wasn't even a color issue. It was a class issue. He was a slave. He was a former slave. Mm-hmm. And for them, her family were free people. Mm-hmm. They had been free black people in the North. Mm-hmm. There was a small free black population that had always existed in the North. And that was both sides of her family. So they looked down on him as a former slave because there were such worries like, well, does this mean we have to invite his former master? Do we have to invite other slaves? There was all these issues where they weren't being facetious in raising these questions with their daughter, but they literally said they would ask questions. Well, what kinds of people are going to be coming to this wedding? Are there going to be because in their minds they didn't even want to invite former white slave owners because they didn't like them either. They only liked Northerners. They only liked black or white Northerners, and they only liked educated people. So it really was, in the clearest sense, a very class-based family. And they felt that even though he was a senator, she was marrying beneath herself. And he had a great deal of money at this time because even when they got married, they took before they went on their honeymoon, he went to Saks, as in Saks Fifth Avenue. Back then it was just called Saks and Company in New York, in Manhattan, and bought all of their honeymoon clothing. And I have the canceled checks from Saks and Company that he wrote to them to buy their honeymoon clothing. So he was able to dazzle her family with his wealth. So that's kind of how he won them over. And he didn't insist that his family be there, which was an unfortunate choice for him. But he did remain close to a couple of his brothers.
According to the book, you only have one photograph of him, right?
I have one photograph
and
of
that's
him, yes.
That's the photograph on the cover. Right?
That's the photograph on the cover.
And he was accused of having Negroid features or being too dark.
Can you imagine? And he's already a light complexion man with rather, you can look at him, any black person could look at him and say clearly he is either black or half black or part black. But her family and others of their black upper class crowd were saying, oh my gosh, he's too dark, he's too Negroid, when in fact, he did not at all look like, like what the average, like what who I consider myself an average African-American looking man looked like. But it just shows you to what extent people cared in that crowd and at that time about color and hair texture and features and things like that.
Something that still goes on to this day.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it was something that even his grandkids had to deal with later when they moved to New York.
During this time, and you alluded to earlier, there was rising racial terrorism in Mississippi and throughout the South as Reconstruction kind of unraveled.
Exactly.
Tell us what happened with his term.
His first year and a half, he was very, very meek and understandably, because for a variety of reasons. One, he had never spent time in Washington. The second reason is that obviously he was the only black person in the Senate chamber. And the other concern was that he knew he didn't have the support or even friendship of his fellow senator from Mississippi, Senator Alcorn. So he really felt very alone there and relied on the guidance of Senator Conkling from New York and Senator Hoare from Massachusetts. So I would say by the second or third year, he started to hit his stride and would speak out on issues, everything from, and not just dealing with black people, also dealing with Chinese immigration, speaking out on behalf of Chinese. So he really did speak out on behalf of the minority communities, the few minority communities that existed in the nation at that time. He spoke out on behalf of blacks at West Point who were being brutalized and just horrible things happening to them. He spoke out on behalf of blacks who had tried to escape the Deep South and move to Kansas. They call them the exodusters, trying to get them money and funding and clothing, things like that. So he would speak out on behalf of those. And by the end, he was even fighting to get money that had been lost through the Freedman Savings Bank. There's thousands and thousands of black families who had lost their money. So by the end, he certainly was speaking out on those issues, but he often was the lone spokesperson on those issues. So even though the record states that he would put bills out there, other than Roscoe Conkling or George Hoare, there was very little support. So he most often was ending up supporting them on their issues, but they were not out there fighting on behalf of African Americans.
Do you know how he was treated by his colleagues?
They wouldn't eat with him.
Right.
They wouldn't. There were some that, when invited to his home, would come, and those were often, and they were, President Grant had come to his home. There were, and he really did have a core constituency. Obviously, he was very close to Frederick Douglass, and although sometimes they competed with each other, he was, towards the end, close to Booker T. Washington, and they very much competed with each other.
Right.
And then their wives also ultimately competed with each other. But he did have his Mississippi. Those congressmen from Mississippi were close to him, but he was a stranger in Washington, except among the black upper class families, like the Wormley family that owned a hotel where, ironically, which is where the Compromise of 1877, where President Grant's people signed that, was at a black-owned hotel.
That's fascinating.
Because Washington has always had this this class of blacks that owned property, owned businesses, in the same way that Atlanta had that in an early time, that cities in the North didn't really have that at that time, as cities in the South and in Washington had.
Now, he didn't make, as we would call it these days, constituent trips.
No, he couldn't. He could not go back to Mississippi.
Couldn't go back. No.
Couldn't go back there. He could go to other places, and he traveled the country speaking on behalf of black issues and Republicans. He did a lot for Howard University when his Senate tenure was over. And probably the one thing that very few people knew, and I didn't know at the time, that after his Senate term was up, he got a tremendous appointment from President Garfield, where he was Register of the U.S. Treasury, which put his money on all U.S. currency.
You said he was the first black to have his name on U.S. currency.
Absolutely, and that was tremendous. And Congress didn't realize when they approved that appointment, they weren't really focused on the fact that his name would be on there. And some congressmen got very upset, but they weren't going to change the law. So, and he held that appointment for several years, and then got it again when President McKinley came in. So he held positions under 4 presidents. And so, unlike most Reconstruction members of Congress, black members of Congress that got jobs through Reconstruction, he held his power. The other ones lost their power. They lost their money. A lot of them, died destitute. But he, on the other hand, he was the wealthiest black in all of Washington, and right up until his death. So he coupled with his wife's money, they invested wisely, owned a lot of property, and held the plantation. The plantation remained in the family until like the late 1920s or early 1930s. Of course, it was called a farm then.
And who worked the plantation?
He had blacks working the plantation. Well, it was called the Bruce Plantation in Bolivar, Mississippi. Obviously, they were paid. They were not. Right. These were not. Even though you call these, they still kept the term the plantation. A lot of the some would change their name to farms, but it was still called
he was like sharecroppers on there.
These were sharecroppers, exactly. They were sharecroppers. They had small houses, and after he died, his wife maintained the property, and then when she died, his son kept it, and then eventually sold it.
Now you talk about the dynasty here, because he served 6 years in the Senate from 1875 to 1880, 81?
81, yeah. Right. He was really elected in 1874, but he didn't take office until 1875.
Now, he and his wife had, how many children did they have?
They had just one son, Roscoe, and who was raised like an affluent child of today. Went to private schools. Of course, back then, he went to the schools in Washington were segregated, so he went to segregated schools in Washington. Then they sent him away to Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire because Senator Hoare's children and nephews had gone there, and he noticed that there were a lot of senators, and President Lincoln's son had gone to Exeter, so he said, I want to send my son to, because he had the money, they had the sophistication, so he sent him to Exeter. Mm-hmm. He was one of 5 black boys at Exeter, so I know that was a tough experience. I've read all of his letters that he wrote home to his family and wrote to his girlfriend, who was a childhood sweetheart back in Washington, who was going to Dunbar. It was called M Street High School then, which was the black high school in the country, and it was in Washington. Mm-hmm. And Ed Brooke went there, in fact.
Okay, right, that's right.
So they sent Roscoe to Exeter, and then he went off to Harvard, and which again was an unusual experience. But they kept saying, we can't bring him back to the South. We can't keep him in Washington where everything is segregated. Of course, they could have sent him to Howard or Morehouse, but this was the complex aspect of the senator and his wife. They felt uncomfortable, like they had a foot in two worlds, that they worked alongside these well-to-do whites and well-to-do blacks, but then they also, since they living in a segregated city, were living around people that didn't have any money at all. Even though they lived in fabulous townhouses, they were back in the alleys where very poor black people.
Yes.
So they didn't very successfully raise their son with a strong black identity, because even though they individually had it, they, having sent their son away at age 14 or 15 to an all-white prep school in New Hampshire, there was just no way that he was going to have a strong, positive black experience when he was away from his family, 9 months out of the year. And then at Harvard, the same, even though Harvard's obviously very different now, but Harvard in 1898, when he arrived there, was, a 99.9% white school. So he continued to date his black girlfriend, who then went to Radcliffe, but she too had the black experience that he was having, which was she was one of 3 black girls at Radcliffe.
Yes.
And wasn't even allowed to live on campus or in the dorms. Yes. He was allowed to live there.
Yeah. That kind of quota system continued well into the 60s and 70s. A couple of people I know who went to certain schools, they only had 2 blacks per class.
Absolutely. Yeah. So things took a long time before they changed, because, having gone to Harvard myself, my wife did as well, we know that you never meet black alumni kids. There's tons of white kids who's, my daddy went here, my mom went here, right. But you never meet black folks who can tell that same story. Huh. So, interestingly, the Bruce family could tell that story for 3 generations, because not only did Roscoe and Clara go there, but then they sent their kids there.
Yes.
Sent them to Exeter, Radcliffe, Harvard, and even Harvard Law School.
Yes.
But interestingly enough, things had changed so much by the time the grandkids got there, they were not allowed to live in the dorms like the father lived. Huh. So Roscoe Sr. was allowed to live in the dorms, but when Roscoe Jr. got there, the president of Harvard at the time, President Lowell, sent a letter to him and said, we no longer allow black boys to live in the freshman dormitories. So Roscoe Sr., the senator's son, who was furious because he said, well, I went to this school, I give money every year to this school. And he said, and he was superintendent of schools of Washington down in D.C. by this point, had worked for Booker T. Washington. He started a national campaign against Harvard to get them to change the rules. So Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was on the board of Harvard, said, this is outrageous, you've got to integrate the dorms. So this family was militant sometimes when it related to issues that affected well-to-do blacks or middle-class blacks, but not so much when it affected working-class or poor blacks.
Interesting. Senator Bruce died in the late 1890s, right?
1898,
okay,
yes.
1898. His son was at school at that time, right?
His son was just finishing Exeter, about to go off to Harvard.
And then what happened to him after that?
After he graduated from Harvard, and he graduated Phi Beta Kappa. Brilliant guy, very smart guy. And he couldn't get a job. Couldn't get a job anywhere. All of his white classmates were going off to banks and companies, and mind you, there were only, and I have the Phi Beta Kappa photo of the group of Phi Beta Kappa students graduating, there were only about 18 of them. So here is this black young man graduating Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard. Nobody will hire him in any capacity except for to get a job as a waiter or as a busboy or as a cook or as a porter on a train. His mother contacts Booker T. Washington and says, can you hire, because Booker and her husband and she had all been very good friends, can you hire him to work at Tuskegee? So he brought, Booker T. Washington had hired him actually during his senior year to work as a spy for him, literally as a spy, because Booker T. Washington had a lot of detractors in Boston and New York, like W.E.B. Du Bois, who were very critical of Booker T. Washington, justifiably, because Booker T. Washington's approach to educating blacks was purely through industrial training. His attitude was, he said, don't try to be an educator or a doctor or a lawyer or a business person. Let white people take those important high-ranking jobs that require education. You should be the laborers. You should be the carpenters, the painters, the cooks, the seamstresses, those types of work. And many blacks, like W.B. Du Bois, said, wait a second, why should we be second-class citizens and accept that? Why shouldn't we demand that our children become teachers and scientists and educators? So, and lawyers and so forth. So Booker T. Washington literally hired Roscoe, while Roscoe was a senior at Harvard, to go to meetings, to sneak in on meetings, write to him about what were the Bostonians and the people in Cambridge, that Harvard, that big black liberal Harvard community that was critical of Booker T. Washington. He then kept him on, and he went down to head up his academic department down at Tuskegee in Alabama. He worked there for 2 years. During that time, he got married to Clara, his childhood sweetheart, who had gone to Radcliffe, and who frankly was smarter than he was. She used to write Roscoe's speeches. She used to help edit Booker T. Washington's speeches. She was brilliant. She ended up going to Boston University Law School and was the first black woman to first black to head a law review. She became president of their law review at BU Law School. So she too could not get a job. So this was a couple that had fabulous education, that were brilliant and talented. But then ultimately by 1909, he got offered a job to come down to Washington, D.C. and become superintendent of the schools. And this was the colored schools, the black schools. So he was superintendent of the schools. They were the toast of Washington. They were like the second generation power couple now, because they had been born in Washington. They had come back. He was a senator's son. He was superintendent of schools. He had joined the Boulay, which is an exclusive black men's fraternity. She was, like the socialite that her mother-in-law had been. She was there with a degree she had gone to Radcliffe and had a degree from BU Law School. She was also a writer, writing for the Washington Saturday Evening Post. They had 3 children. Their children went to black schools then they sent them off to boarding school. It was really the third generation that kind of fell apart, that even though they went to these great schools, the daughter, who's the daughter of Roscoe and Clara, who is now the granddaughter of the senator, she goes to Radcliffe. She elopes with a black childhood sweetheart from Washington, who is a black actor who appears in black movies, in Oscar Micheaux movies. Yes. And as a black actor, but a light complexion guy. He decides in 1941, he decides that he wants to get roles in white movies. But in order to do that, he has to pass. So he changes his name from Barrington Guy to Barrington Sharma and says that he's now passing. And he says that he's half Italian and half Indian. And he starts getting roles in white films and white theater. This, though, of course, means Clara has to pass, because she can't be black if her husband is no longer black, so she starts passing. Then the oldest son, Roscoe Jr., after he leaves Harvard, the family is hired by the Rockefellers, because John D. Rockefeller, the big philanthropist in New York, says, I want to do something for black folks in New York. And what I want to do is I want to build an apartment complex just for the black middle class and black upper class in Harlem. The Dunbar still exists on 150th Street. Yes. But he needs a black family who has the cachet and the sophistication, who will know how to literally handpick the black families who can live there and manage the development. Because he says it shouldn't be like a plantation where whites managing a black development. Yes. So he said, very liberal, said, I want blacks to manage it. He picks the Bruces, Roscoe and Clara, Roscoe Sr., Clara Sr. to manage it. They do it. They go to him, they said, can you find our son a job, who's just left Harvard, find him a job managing an apartment development for him. So the Rockefellers find a job for him to manage development in Newark. Unfortunately, the kid is young. He mismanages and loses like $1,500. He's too afraid to go to his parents and say, I need some money to replace this. So instead, he goes out into the streets of Newark, hires 2 black guys to fake a holdup.
Oh, boy.
And the police discover it's a fake holdup. They charge him with embezzlement. He goes to trial, a big sensational trial. It's all across the pages of the New York Amsterdam News, the New York Times, everything. You know, black senator's grandson charged with embezzlement. He's found guilty. He goes to prison for 2 years. The family is literally bankrupted by trying to fight to get him out of prison, to get them to win the trial. And then the Rockefellers, unfortunately, even though they've been so good to the family, they dump them like a bad habit. They fire them from their jobs. They go to David Rockefeller, who's still alive today, and they say, can you loan us $800? Our youngest son is in his 3rd year at Harvard Law School. We just need $800 to finish the tuition to pay off some of our food bills. David Rockefeller says no. Now, of course, they are practically billionaires at that time. They won't loan them $800. So that was the beginning of the end. So right after he refuses to loan them $800, they go on welfare. So they apply for public assistance. So the family that was once this very wealthy family, all of their money spent on tuitions and schooling and, fabulous townhouses and everything, they are now literally destitute. The daughter is now passing, and the son is in prison. The 3rd son has to drop out of Harvard Law School. And then Roscoe and Clara end up working in a dry cleaner.
Roscoe Sr.
Yeah. The man who was Phi Beta Kappa Harvard, who had been superintendent of schools, is now working in a dry cleaners on Madison Avenue in New York City. So that, and then the final grace note is 3 years ago, the U.S. Senate unveiled a portrait of Senator Blanche Bruce in the Capitol, and the Clintons had been working very hard to try to get a black, member of Congress in a portrait. Right. So finally, they got one. They unveiled it. The Senate invited all of the descendants of this illustrious Bruce family. Right. Only one person shows up, a black doctor. She lives in Kansas City. And I interviewed her for my book.
And what's her relation to the family?
She is the great niece of Senator Bruce. His brother, I forgot the name of the brother, I think it was James, that's her great-great-grandfather. She shows up. None of the other family members show up. And many of them live in New York here, because I have been contacted by many of them since the book just came out. They live as white people. They pass as white people. And I said, why didn't you go to the Senate unveiling? And they said, well, they had all these explanations and everything, and they've wanted to meet me in strange places, out of the way places in the village. I said, here's your chance to claim being related to the first, and these are not nieces and nephews. These are great-great-grandchildren, direct descendants. Direct descendants. They will not own up to being related to this great man. It's a big issue. It really, even today, you would think, why in 2006 is this even necessary? So because I was hoping to try to get some of the family members to help me in my campaign, I'm trying to get the U.S. Postal Service to create a stamp honoring Senator Bruce. Because, as I know, Shelton, you and I were talking about this before, but the Postal Service has issued stamps for 159 years. They have never once put a black elected official on a stamp. Now, they have white congressmen, white governors, white senators, and obviously white presidents on stamps. They even have the first woman senator, Hattie Caraway. She has a stamp. The first Hispanic-American senator, Dennis Chavez, is on a stamp. They've never put a black elected official of any level on a stamp.
I would have thought they would have at least put, the great Adam Clayton Powell on there.
He doesn't have a stamp. Shirley Chisholm doesn't have a stamp.
Shirley Chisholm, exactly.
Right, of course. They haven't done it. So who do they put on stamps? I mean, it's wonderful. They should rightfully put on people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. But who else populates most of our stamps? Black athletes and black singers and entertainers. Because unfortunately, that's how the world and the government sees Black America as entertainers, athletes, not as important political figures that are changing the world. So that's why when I look at, the 2006 election season, I wonder, is America going to be able to accept and vote for any of these black Senate candidates that are running, both in the Democratic and Republican Party? Are they going to accept it? Because like I said, what's changed? In 132 years, we had a black senator. 132 years ago, we still only have one out of 100.
That's amazing.
And it's disappointing.
Well, I know that Roscoe Sr. and his wife died in the late 40s, 50s.
Right. Yeah, he died in 1950. She died in 49.
What about Roscoe Jr.?
Roscoe Jr., after he got out of prison, he was there for 2 years, got out of prison, came back, went to Paris to go to the Sorbonne. Now, remember, this family, even though they ended up destitute, had a very affluent lifestyle. So even Roscoe Jr. was sent to Exeter, went to Harvard, they drove Cadillacs in the 1920s and 30s. I mean, they were living very well back when Cadillac was the car du jour for the rich people. Sure. They lived very nicely. So he was never an extremely hardworking guy. He got, and his wife at that time, right before he went to prison, left him and she was from a very well-to-do black family from Virginia. But he married again. And he and his brother ran a small real estate business. His brother, Burrell, who was a lawyer, he was one from Harvard Law School, still passed the bar even though he had to drop out of Harvard Law School in the third year. So they ran a small business in Harlem. He had 2 daughters. Roscoe Sr. had 2 daughters. And Clara Jr., his older sister, who passed for white, she had 2 sons. And remember, we're all in New York now. Right. I mean, we're not in some far-off place in Mississippi, Kansas, like we're going to disappear. Everybody's in New York, in the New York City. I'm not talking about, out in the burbs somewhere. They're in New York City. And all of these great-grandchildren of the senator were being raised in the New York, New Jersey area. Wow. So
is Roscoe Jr. still alive or no?
Oh, no. He died. Roscoe Jr. died in the 1970s or late 1970s. Late 1970s. Okay. But his kids are alive.
The kids are alive.
His kids are alive and living in New York.
And they won't come out. They won't.
No, I'm hoping, and I hope maybe this is an opportunity to plug my book signing.
Yes, please.
I'm hoping they'll come to my book signing. Maybe I'll get to meet them. But I'm going to be signing books on Thursday at Barnes & Noble Lincoln Center.
What day is Thursday?
Thursday, July 13th.
July 13th, okay.
At 7 p.m. at Barnes & Noble Lincoln Center here in New York City.
Okay.
So, even if they want to anonymously come out into the crowd and introduce themselves to me, because I think this is an important story, and I honestly believe that if there was a descendant out there willing to be out there talking about, to represent the family, more people would know about it, about this great man, in the same way that what allowed us to talk about Malcolm X and what allowed us to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King was the fact that there was Atlas Shabazz and Betty Shabazz, talking about Malcolm X, and the fact that Coretta Scott King was talking about, and Dexter and the other children of these great figures were there. It gives the media, gives the public a face, a current face to put on this great story.
Yeah. Your previous book, Our Kind of People, and people were upset with you because you raised the very uncomfortable issue of skin color, the fact that there are people out here who like to pass, and don't want to admit, for a variety of reasons, don't want to say who they truly are. And I think you really, I think you do. I think you've done everyone in your books a public service, and I think you've also probably helped people become healthy. To talk about these issues, because I think there's a lot of dissembling that goes on.
Exactly. I appreciate your saying that, because when most people talk about the Black experience in America, whether they are authors or just people that are just speaking about it in the media, they often don't talk about the Black experience beyond poverty or the Black experience beyond the hip-hop culture. And those are all legitimate stories. They're all authentically Black. But, growing up Black in this country, my parents grew up in the segregated South. Mm-hmm. So in Memphis, my parents always talked about it. And, when I got married to my wife, Pamela, when we met at Harvard, her parents grew up in she talked about her parents growing up in the segregated South. So our lives are very similar. She grew up in Detroit. I grew up in New York. But as growing up as Black people, we often know the story of some Blacks looking at us and saying, oh, well, you're not authentically Black because you speak this way.
Yes.
You went to these schools, those kinds of things. And it's but for us, most of my life and most of our world, both my wife and myself and our 3 children, is a very Black world. And so it might be because it's Jack and Jill, it might be because where we summer, it might be where we go to church, but it's important for us to talk about this Black experience too, and not to give allow people to say that whites own the license on correct diction, or whites own the license on ambition, or becoming lawyers or doctors or bankers or scientists or teachers, that we too, as black folks, can do this and still be authentically black.
You've written about all these different issues, and you've, I guess you touched the third rail of black life when it comes to color.
I've been very controversial. I've talked about, I got in trouble when I wrote an essay called "I Never Dated a White Girl." I've been taken to task for a whole lot of stuff.
This whole thing that we have is a phenomenon that Bill Cosby was raised and other people raised, that somehow if you do certain things that you're not authentically black, and that if you, even marriage now here is something considered for white people, and education is considered for white people. And
well, there's a lot of truth to what Bill Cosby's saying, and I know there was a firestorm of people getting upset, saying that Bill Cosby was turning against sort of the black youth or the hip hop culture, in the same way that some blacks are saying that Oprah Winfrey is not supportive of the black rap stars. I have to say that if it was not for Oprah Winfrey and Bill Cosby, there would not be the positive self-image that young black people have about themselves, because they have been tremendous catalysts for making sure that there are positive black role models on television. Yes. You look back at the I won't even go back to, the Cosby, what he did in the 60s and 70s, but just look at the Cosby Show in the 80s. Mm-hmm. We didn't have an intact black family with a mother and a father and kids that went to school, used correct diction, loved their parents, got along, and the show was not about race, because there were a lot of black people that said when that show came out, oh, that's not real black people, that's not, black people don't live like that. And there were white people saying, oh, black people don't live like that. There are lots of black people that live like that all around the nation. And there were black people living like that in the 1940s and 50s. When my parents were growing up in the segregated South, they only knew about black school teachers and black doctors because the doctor they went to was a black doctor. Mm-hmm. The bank that they went to was a black-owned bank. The insurance company they went to was a black-owned insurance company. There was the black-owned newspaper in the town. The barber shops, the restaurants, they were all owned by black people. And that's what the kind of pride that Bill Cosby. And I say to people, how many of these hip-hop stars have given $20 million to a black college?
Yes,
you know what I'm saying? I mean, my feeling is he put his money where his mouth was. He said, black folks have to look to themselves. And he's not saying what Booker T. Washington was saying, we have to take some subservient stand. In the same way that Oprah Winfrey, it's sure, are there a lot of white stars that appear on her show? Yes. But when Oprah Winfrey writes the checks, they are going to big black organizations like 100 Black Men and, black organizations that are supporting the black causes. And also when she did her Legends Ball, who was she honoring? Those are all sisters up there.
That's right.
So, it's a difficult life, I'm sure. I'll never know what it's like to be a Bill Cosby and Oprah Winfrey, but at the same time, I don't think that he was ever trying to, with a broad brush, just say, dismissing so many of these young black folks. But I think that what he was saying is they need to step up to the table.
Yes.
And because I ask myself, how many of them give money to the NAACP? How many of them give money to the Urban League?
Yes.
The very organizations that made it possible for them to live in that, Lil Kim's mansion out in Alpine, New Jersey. And I'm not trying to diss her, but I'm saying for any of these big celebrities, P. Diddy, whatever, they live in this fabulous lifestyle, stuff in the Hamptons and all that kind of stuff. But if it wasn't for the NAACP, there'd be no house in the Hamptons. There'd be no Alpine, New Jersey. There would be no ability to have the mobility that they have.
Yes.
So I'm saying give back to okay, you might not embrace the concept of marriage. You might not embrace you have the 3 baby mamas and all that kind of foolishness, which I too am offended by, because I say I want my 3 black kids, they'll make the choices that they want, but I don't want them to constantly have to fight this stereotype that says, black fathers don't marry the mothers of their children, or black people don't embrace education, or black people don't, take care of the responsibilities, that they're just living large, this ghetto fabulous lifestyle. It's misleading to a lot of young black kids who get out there and say, oh my gosh, I do need an education. I'm not going to make it as a basketball star. I'm not going to make it as a rap star. So, but I think all these stories are authentic black stories, and no one of them is more authentic than the other.
Do you think rap music this rap culture has, what do you make of it? Do you think it's helpful or hurtful?
Hey, I admit that I listen to Public Enemy. I mean, I'm dating myself here, but I mean, but I love, a lot of the rap music, but I have to say, it's just music.
Right.
Don't make it a lifestyle choice, because if you look at some of the misogynistic messages, the anti-female messages, that a woman is nothing but her body.
Right.
That becomes very dangerous to a young girl who doesn't know who she's supposed to be if she's a black girl. Mm-hmm. It just as dangerous as the point that I was making when I wrote my essay in my book Member of the Club, when I talked about interracial marriage, interracial dating, that I said that I'd never dated a white girl, and that was the title of the essay. But I said the bigger issue here is not who we marry, who we fall in love with, but the issue is, what does it mean when our most powerful black men in America make the decision never to marry a black woman? That what does it mean, that Clarence Thomas, forget about O.J. Simpson, forget about all these Barry Bondses and, and the athletes, because I don't give a damn about the athletes and the entertainers.
Right.
Does it upset me that Quincy Jones, has never married a black woman? Yes, it does. That there have been 3, white blonde women. Yeah, it upsets me. But what upsets me more is when black policymakers who make this decision, because I say to myself, you look at Bill Cosby, if Camille was a white woman, would she have let him give $20 million of their money to this black women's college down in Atlanta? I don't think so. I have to ask the question, it's like if someone happens to fall in love with someone like Henry Louis Gates, head of African American Studies at Harvard. I know his first wife was white. I don't know what his second wife is if he's remarried. But brilliant guy, smart guy. And I got in a lot of trouble. They said, why are you mentioning Henry Louis Gates? Why are you mentioning Cornel West? Because I love these guys and I love the work that they do. But I keep saying, wasn't there a sister out there that you could have, and what is the message we send to young black girls? That they're not attractive enough, that they're not good enough, that that once. See, I'm not saying that I don't approve. I don't care how people do. But I'm just saying we have to also think of the message when the most powerful and important black men do this.
Right.
Because we're not seeing it the other way around. My question is, why aren't we seeing powerful, affluent white men marrying black women?
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, I'm just hoping that the mindset isn't that, okay, now I have power, now I have fame, I have money, now I need a trophy wife. And in our society, trophy wife is like who Tiger Woods married, a blonde-haired Swede or something like that. Because it would have been great, because you think to yourself, okay, what would the black dynasty would have been created when someone like a Tiger Woods.
Some people marry said woman, white woman, whatever, because this is something that has been historically put off limits to some way.
Right.
Is that?
That's very possible. It's very possible. I mean, I think that, and there's also some that because they work in a world that is mostly populated by whites, that can certainly be the case. Right. And my feeling is, yes, you should honestly marry whoever you happen to fall in love with.
Right.
I just find it curious and interesting that people that are in, let's say, the music business or in sports, why does it happen so often there? Mm-hmm. Because those really are worlds where there are black women.
Yeah.
And where they do encounter them. I mean, I know that, a couple of weeks ago when I guess Michael Strahan was taken to task with, with his very big divorce. And then some people raised the issue. I was doing a show. Some people raised the issue and they said, well, wait, his first wife was black back when he didn't have no money.
Right.
But then all of a sudden, he's worth millions and millions and millions and he's married to a white woman. Right. So they showed the $100,000, $150,000 house that his black ex-wife lives down in Texas, but his wife is living in a $10 million house fighting for an $8 million apartment too.
Right.
So there are implications here, and obviously a marriage decision is not a political decision. It's not a business decision. It's an emotional decision. Right. So I hope it is that. But for me, like when I write these books and these stories, especially historical ones, and then you get the issue of passing and you get the issue of marrying light complexioned people, the inevitable issue that comes up is, well, are these people marrying these people because they look a certain way?
Right.
Like did Blanche Bruce marry Josephine Wilson because she looked a certain way, or because her family had wealth and connections that could help his career?
Right.
In their marriage, it was a much more of an equal decision. I mean, it wasn't like, black rich celebrity marrying a poor white nobody. He was marrying someone who really brought a lot to the synergy to this power couple.
These days, black women are marrying white men.
Sure, they are starting to, absolutely.
And I think maybe it's because of economics.
Well, the one thing is that actually it's numbers. If you look at the percentages of black males versus black women in colleges, just say, and I'm even talking about black colleges, not just white colleges, but black colleges, it's typically like a 3 or 4 to 1, 3 or 4 times the number of women. So they don't have the choices when it comes to educated black men who are, and I'm saying this as a black male, that our numbers are so small of those of us who are in school, not in jail. It's unfortunate to have to admit to these numbers, but the statistics really work against black educated women meeting educated black men in both historically black colleges as well as historically white colleges.
Interesting.